This is, hi, this is Jim Glanville. I'm recording this in Wise on Monday the 12th of November 2018. And the presentation that follows comes from a talk I gave about a month ago at the Archaeological Society of Virginia at their annual general meeting, which was held in Winchester. And my title is called Mississippian, Smith, and Washington Counties, The Evidence. And I should tell you that I've been working on Virginia history and Virginia archaeology, not as an archaeologist, but as an amateur for about 15 years now. And I call myself an independent scholar because I'm not associated with any institution. And I should say at the beginning of this talk that I am a member of the remnant Yuchi tribe of Kingsport, Tennessee, and I was adopted into that tribe about 10 years ago. And part of my story, I won't say much about the Yuchi today, but part of my story is that the Yuchi tribe has been in southwest Virginia and northeast Tennessee arguably for over 500 years. I'd like to dedicate this presentation to my good friend, the late Lawrence Richardson, who lived in Adwolf in Smith County. And this shot shows him excavating at the Fox site in Smith County in 1974. He was a dairy farmer. He was a passionate avocational archaeologist, and I admire Lawrence especially because he was the first person in Virginia to figure out that the Yuchi Indians were in Holstonia. Holstonia is my name for southwest Virginia and northeast Tennessee, and I'll show you that on a map in just a second. I'll read you my abstract. This was the abstract I used for my Winchester type. Virginia, Smith, and Washington counties have yielded vast quantities of Mississippian period Indian goods, mostly from floodplains and caves. Almost all of this material went into the private holdings of Indian relic collectors, and this presentation will show images of much of that material drawn from my personal photographs taken during visits to private collections, from the relic collectors' literature, and from contemporary newspaper accounts. In aggregate, the evidence for Mississippian, southwest Virginia is overwhelming. I'll define Mississippian in just a second. Mississippian is a poorly defined term that describes the American Indian societies that occupied the Mississippi watershed and the Deep South during the period from roughly 800 to 1600 AD. The people of these societies were generally mound builders. They relied on maize, that's American corn-based subsistence. They had social ranks. They engaged in ceremonial activities. I'll show you some of those. And produced highly artistic objects with iconic designs from marine shell, from copper, from pottery, and other materials. And they engaged in long-distance trade and exchange. Indian relic collection is the practice of privately accumulating American Indian objects. Of these, points or arrowheads are the most commonly collected objects. There must be millions of folks in America who picked up and collected points at some point or other. But many of the highly artistic relics, which are particularly valued by the relic collectors, such as I'm going to show here, were dug from Indian burials, and that's the sad part of the story. This is an example of Indian relic collection. This is a fellow called Ron Harris, who lives in North Carolina, who I know slightly. And this is him at home, pictured in the Hickory newspaper from about a year ago, showing the typical kind of relic collection with boards of points on the wall and various objects in glass cases. And this is very typical. I've seen dozens of such collections. I've actually seen this one, I've only seen photographs of this one, but I've seen dozens of such collections over the years. In 2000, Michael B. Barber, who is currently the state archaeologist of Virginia, published along with the late Gene Barfield an article in the Journal of Middle Atlantic Archaeology in which they said, quote, "The presence of Mississippian origin artifacts in an isolated area of Virginia has caused some consternation in Virginia archaeology." That was almost 20 years ago. And this was never followed up on. It turned out it was my role to follow up on this. Here's a picture of Gene is now dead. Here's a picture of Gene on the left and Mike Barber on the right, taken by me about 10 years ago. Now, two things have really changed the story of Southwest Virginia in the last 10, 15 years since I've been working on this project. The first thing is that in 1567, the Spaniards who were at the Virginia, Tennessee, the modern Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee border, and at Morgantown, North Carolina, a site was found which was the site and is the site of a Spanish fort built in 1567. This fort has become absolutely mainstream, big league American archaeology. It's had large infusions of money from the federal government, from the National Science Foundation, and it's now absolutely unambiguously a Spanish site, and it's about 40 miles south of the Southwest Virginia border. That's the first development. The other development is that Yuchi history, which has long been neglected, Yuchi history is finally receiving serious academic studies. And taken together, these two developments radically change our view of Southwest Virginia contact period history and prehistory. So that's really the broad aspect of my talk today. And here, just to give you an example, is examples of some recent scholarships. The book on the left is an edited essay collection by Jason Baird Jackson. It's about 5 years old now, and it contains a whole series of essays about the Yuchi people in Southwest Virginia and the Spanish contact, and unambiguously places the Yuchi and the Chisca Indians, who were their close relatives, in Southwest Virginia. In 2013, Robin Beck, who is the chief archaeologist who discovered the site of the Fort San Juan in South Carolina, published a long analysis of the transition from the Mississippian period into the modern contact period. And on the right, just published a couple of years ago, is an essay collection in which Fort San Juan, shown there as Xuala, X-U-A-L-A, is shown as the limits of empire, and discusses, there's a series of essays here which discuss Fort San Juan in terms of the whole Atlantic world. This is the map I mentioned just a second ago. This comes from the 2012 set of essays edited by Jason Baird Jackson, and this is from the article called The Enigmatic Chisca. And you see here, I've actually marked up this map. You can see the state lines there. And so this unambiguously places the Yuchi and their neighbors, their relatives, the Chisca, in Southwest Virginia in 1567. And incidentally, one of the nice aspects, since I know many folks in the Yuchi Nation, I get a lot of Yuchi oral history, and Yuchi oral history tells of the town of Chilhowie, which you can see there just on the left-hand side, was in fact a Yuchi town. This is my chief. This is Chief Lee Vest, pictured a couple of years ago, and he has his white gloves on, and in front of him is the roll which the remnant Yuchi tribe, or the Yuchi tribe, published in 1857. This is actually an intertribal roll, and it has been held as a sacred object for many years, and I was recently granted permission to publish about this post-removal Yuchi roll. We're now 20 years after Indian removal. And so currently I have an article, a paper in press, with the Historical Journal of Southwest Virginia, which tells the story of this roll. And this roll, of course, adds weight to the general story of the Yuchi in Southwest Virginia. So the principal purpose of archaeology, the principal purpose of prehistoric archaeology in Southwest Virginia must surely be to tell the story of the region's pre-Columbian inhabitants. And that's the Yuchi story. And it's very sad in Virginia that we know a great deal about the Pocahontas Indians, we know a good deal about the Monacan Indians, but we know nothing of any Indians in Virginia who were between Lynchburg, say, and the Cumberland Gap. There's a whole 300-mile stretch of Virginia where we know essentially nothing about the Native American people who were there. I published originally, you can see the citation there, I published about this first in 2005. So here I've mentioned Holstonia. Here just blacked out shows the what I consider generally Holstonia. I'll show you another map of this in just a second. And as I've already argued, the Yuchi were the pre-Columbian, meaning before the arrival of Columbus, the pre-Columbian inhabitants of Holstonia. And here you can see the Holston River and its forks. Down in the bottom left you see Knoxville, and the Knoxville, the Tennessee River becomes the Holston River, and then it flows north into Virginia. You can see the Virginia-Tennessee, Virginia-North Carolina border across the center of the screen. And once it gets into Virginia, the Holston River breaks into three forks, the north and the middle and the south. And this is where the rich Indian archaeological heritage of the Yuchi people is. It's along those three rivers, to some extent up in the highlands, but mostly the archaeological history is along those three forks of the Holston River. This is a map modified from one published in Wikipedia. Here's another showing of the same idea. This is, you can see in red here, the Holston River, and you can see this is taken from the U.S. Geological Service, and I've marked out Washington and Smith County, and you can understand why it's those two counties which become Mississippian, because they are the ones which are directly connected to the Holston River. And I show that here, that there's much evidence in the counties in red, Washington and Smith. There's much evidence for Mississippian grave goods, and I'm going to show you lots of those. And in the pink counties, Scott, Russell, and Wythe, we find some evidence of Mississippian grave goods. And it's interestingly, down to the right, to the east of Smith and Washington, that's Grayson County, and there's essentially no evidence at all that I've seen for Mississippian culture in Grayson County. So the Indian burials in Smith and Washington counties are principally on the floodplains adjacent to the three Holston River forks. They're also in the caves that are very common in that region because it's karst landscape. Karst means a lot of landscape which is underlain by limestone and dolomite and gypsum, and that kind of a landscape leads to many, many springs and many, many caves and many, many underground caverns. And I'm going to argue shortly that what happens to Indian culture when it gets to those regions is, rather than being mound builders, which we normally associate with the Mississippian cultures, when they get to those regions, it's convenient to have those caves, and religion, as it's done for 100,000, for 10,000 years, goes underground into the caves. Now this picture illustrates what it might have been like had we been in Holstonia at the time of the Spanish arrival. This is a mural from the McClung Museum in Tennessee. It's a mural by an artist called Greg Harlin, and this is my picture of his mural. And what it shows are leaders of the late Mississippian period, around 1500, in Tennessee. And you saw from the earlier map that this is only just downstream from Holstonia via the Holston River. And I'm going to show you on the next slide, I'll show you a blow-up of this, and I'll show you some of the objects which are pictured by Harlin in this mural, which I'm going to show you coming from Holstonia. So this is detail. This slide shows detail from the preceding Greg Harlin mural. And if you look on the left, the chief there, who's marked up, his face has got characteristic markings, but on his chest you see a large object made of shell, which is called a gorget, G-O-R-G-E-T. And there are literally hundreds of gorgets which come from Smith and Washington counties. Almost none of them mentioned, almost none of them recorded by professional archaeologists, but hundreds of them known from the collections, the private collections of relic collectors. On the right, you see more objects from Holstonia, and you see another gorget there on the right. That's, again, part of that detail. And on the upper right, it's not too easy to see it in this picture, but there's a stone platform pipe. And it's gorgets and stone pipes which are absolutely characteristic of Holstonia, of Smith and Washington counties. And this mural by Greg Harlin, quote, is based on research by the University of Tennessee archaeologists who excavated Toqua in the 1970s. Toqua is a famous site on the Little Tennessee River. It's probably about 100 miles away from Southwest Virginia. Now, how does Holstonia become Mississippian? Now, this is a map. Excuse me. This is a map taken from Ann Otterson's thesis. You can see the citation for her thesis down below. She did a wonderful job of trying to go through the Mississippian world and categorize artifacts across the entire Mississippian world. Her work is not at all well known, and she eventually left archaeology and went into seclusion. But if you look at this map, The green region shows what's called the Tennessee-Holston Valley Mississippian region. And you see I've outlined in black there, you can see that region that I've mentioned as a Holstonia. So if you understand that the Mississippi River Mississippian period is directly related to Holstonia, you can see that it's easy for the Holstonian culture to come up the Holston River from the green region. Now in the beginning, of course, archaeology was Indiana Jones. And in November of 1922, Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon, an amateur, entered King Tut's tomb, of course, and found the immense treasure. And almost everybody has heard of King Tut's tomb when they opened the sarcophagus. The Archaeological Society of Virginia was founded in January of 1940, and that's, 78 years ago, and it was founded originally as the Virginia Indian Relic Collectors Club, when 17 Virginians met at the Valentine Museum in Virginia. So modern-day archaeology has its roots in relic collecting. Now here's an important aspect. I'm going to read this to you. Here's an important aspect of archaeology in Holstonia. This comes from C.G. Holland's book, which is called the Archaeological Survey of Southwest Virginia, which he published in 1970. And this comes from the preface, and this is very much part of my story today. About 40 years ago, one of a family of several brothers began to dig at night in open sites and to enter caves for artifacts. Through the following years, this man, whose name was Robey Maiden, with single-minded determination, dug in nearly all the open pottery-bearing sites and caves within a large radius of Saltville. The artifacts sought were mainly pipes, ear ornaments, shell pendants, and similar objects that were highly prized and sold well. Others of the family took up this activity, and the pattern spread to embrace many people in their town, in Saltville, and the surrounding community. It is estimated that 40 to 50 people are now engaged in this destructive digging between Tazewell and Washington counties. That's a large part of the reason why this part of the country is not understood, because so much of it was done by amateurs, by grave robbers, by the folks that Holland is discussing. And here's a picture, comes from the Museum of the Middle Appalachians, that I published in 2007. These are the 7 Maiden brothers, and Robey is standing in the middle with the black jacket and the tie. There's a picture from a newspaper article, and Robey lived, you can see the years that he lived. Now, Robey Maiden had a big relic collection, all disappeared, I think was sold after his death, and these were pictures which were given to me by Tom Totten, the late Tom Totten, who was a good friend of mine, and Tom Totten described the pictures I see here as all Saltville stuff. I have no idea where the objects present, where these objects are, with the exception of the big pipe on the right. I'll tell you about that in just a minute or later on. And you see in the upper 2 slides, we see Gorgets from the Saltville area. On the bottom left, a platform pipe, called a platform pipe for the obvious reasons that the stem rises up from a flat platform. This is Clarence Maiden, who I actually show you pictures. Clarence was the senior of the Maiden brothers, who struggled during the Depression, kept the family together. On the left, you see Clarence Maiden with this is a file picture of Clarence Maiden holding many pipes, and on the right, this is Clarence Maiden pictured in his relic closet. Clarence was not particularly a digger, but Clarence, through his brother and through many other people, Clarence organized digging teams, and there would be groups of people who would go, at that time perfectly legally, would simply go to Indian burial grounds and dig them up and remove the valuable artistic objects for sale. Now, to return to Mike Barber, the region around Saltville was called the Salt-Powered Chieftain, and it was given this name by Mike Barber and Gene Barfield in 1996. And in that 1996 paper, they said that the prehistory is, quote, one of the most, prehistory of Saltville is, quote, one of the most fascinating developments within the Native American cultures within the Commonwealth of Virginia. But as I mentioned earlier, this work was not followed up on. The 2 citations for that work are shown on the bottom of the slide. Here's what Barber and Barfield said about the Saltpout chiefdom, and this is a key to understanding why there are so many Indian relics and why it is such a Mississippian period. Quote, heirs of Smith and Washington counties. Heirs of Smith and Washington counties, Virginia, have long been known for the recovery of abundant exotic goods dating to the late woodland period. That's in Virginia, that's what we call the late Mississippian period. These objects include Citico conch shell gorgets, copper discs, beads, and small funerary pots. The presence of these Mississippian origin artifacts in an isolated area of Virginia has caused some consternation in Virginia archaeology. The authors suggest, that's Barber and Barfield, they suggest that this displacement of trade goods is a direct function of the exploitation of the salt deposits at Saltville due to the high saltville content of the brine. And it's hypothesized that in an indigenous late woodland Mississippian population, they provided salt to trade to the southeast in exchange for exotic goods. So this is the explanation for why there is so much of that material in Smith and Washington counties. They were trading salt all throughout the southeast and bringing in rich objects. Some we don't know whether they were made there or whether they were brought in already made. But in any event, there was an extensive trade system based on salt. This is also true for Nashville. There are professional papers about Nashville which say that the rich Mississippian period in Nashville is also based on extensive trade of salt from Nashville to other places. So that salt trade, quoting Barber and Barfield again, heirs of Smith and Washington counties, Virginia, have long been known for the recovery of these exotic goods dating to the late woodland, the Mississippian period. And those include all the things that I mentioned earlier. And these objects have caused some consternation in Virginia archaeology. And I hope that in the preceding slides I've been able to rationalize how it is that Mississippian materials come to be in Smith and Washington counties. Fundamentally, Barber and Barfield proposed that salt was traded out for high-quality incoming goods. Caves are also important in understanding what's going on in Holstonia. Caves substituted for mounds as Indian ceremonial and religious sites. And the citation below, which comes from 1997, which is now Mike Barber and David Hubbard, tells that there are 1997, there were 37 known Indian burial caves in Virginia, 34 of which were in Smith and Washington counties, and only 3 of which remain undisturbed by looters. So this is where the material I'm going to show you in the remaining part of this talk, it is from these kind of sources that this material came. Now, on a note of caution, because these objects are highly valuable, fake pipes especially are common. There are lots of stone pipes which are of modern manufacture and made. I've seen them made. There are also lots of fake gorgets. Gorgets are less common and they're somewhat easier to spot than fake pipes, but there are still lots of fake gorgets. But with a couple of exceptions that I'll note as we go through, I believe that this presentation is free of reproductions and fakes. I think with the noted exceptions, the things I'm going to show you are okay. Now this is a most remarkable place that I visited about 12 years ago. This is in New Jersey. This is in Sussex County, New Jersey, which is about 60, 70 miles northwest of New York City. And there was a fellow there whose name was Ralph Space. I never met him, but I met his son. And back in the 30s, Ralph Space was kind of an early Tony Soprano. He figured out during the Prohibition period, Ralph Space figured out that you could make booze in Sussex County, New Jersey, and run it in fire trucks into New York City and make millions. And that's exactly what he did. But Ralph was like so many other country people. He was very close, turns out, to the Appalachian Trail. And as a kid, he had found arrowheads and points. And so many people who begin by studying or picking up arrowheads and points, when they get wealthy and later in life, become upscale Indian relic collectors. I've known dozens of men, almost all men, over my period of work, who fall into that category. So on the left, you see a picture from the web. This is the Space Farms Zoo Museum. It literally is a zoo museum. And the collection is said to contain 25,000 Virginia objects. He met Rufus Pickle of Marion. I'm going to say more about Rufus Pickle, and I published about Rufus Pickle, and in 31. And I've actually got an article from the Lawrence Richardson collection, which describes how they first met in 1931 and drove down to Tennessee together looking for Indian relics. And for many years, every summer, Space would go down, stay in Marion, stay in Smyth County, and they would go relic collecting together. So just look on the right. These are all objects which were collected by Ralph Space and Rufus Pickle, and they come from Southwest Virginia. Here are Gorgets that come from Southwest Virginia. These are shell objects made from marine shell. I showed you a picture of a marine shell early on, and from a conch or a whelk shell. And you can see here all kinds of sizes. The holes on the Gorgets are so-called suspension holes. Typically these objects were hung on deerskin or cords and worn on the chest. They were worn by, it's not entirely clear who wore them. They were worn presumably by priests, by high-ranking people, but many were also worn by women. And interestingly, in the grave finds, many of the Gorgets are found on the graves of children. So they had symbolic and religious significance, which we don't really understand. We don't have any written records. We don't exactly understand what the significance is, but it's clear that they have special significance. Here you see, at the back, you see more examples of shell objects. There are actually some animal teeth in the front. But what's important here is the little marker, which is down on the bottom left. And these objects were, quote, found by Ralph Space and R.W. Pickle. So as I say, I've written a whole long article about this. Now these are pipes, platform pipes, also taken at the Space Farms Zoo and Museum. And you see the one on the left is a classic example. The designs are so-called square box eyes, and they're on the left of these pipes. And again, presumably from Smyth County and Washington County because of their provenance. Here are the picture of them. This is Ralph Space on the left. It's a picture I took. It's a picture on the wall at Space Farms. As I say, I never met him, but I met his son Fred. And on the right is a picture of Rufus Pickle taken in his basement museum. I'll show you a picture of Pickle's collection later. But there it is. So this is part of the Rufus Pickle collection in Marion. It was an undated picture, but it was taken about 1970. And again, thanks to Tom Totten, the late Tom Totten, who provided me with many pictures of this kind of material. But you can see there all the shell objects, and there's an incredible collection in the basement. Now this is a typical site. This is the Kinderhook site, which is on the Holston North Fork. You remember that from the map. Nothing was ever dug from here professionally, but if you look towards the center left of the picture on the plowed field, you can see the dark earth, the darkened earth, which was characteristic of graveyards or places where Indian burials were. That was the kind of site that the diggers would look for. And there were no doubt hundreds of graves which were robbed here without ever any professional involvement at all, dug because the relics could be sold into the relic collectors community. This is the only case I know of a Mississippian object dug by a professional archaeologist. This is the so-called Slattery Citico style Gorget. It's actually I won't go into great detail, but it's actually a symbolic rattlesnake. And if you look on the lower left of the Gorget, you can see the characteristic chevrons of the rattlesnake's tail. And I took the picture on the right. This is at the Sproles site along the North Fork of the Holston River in Washington County. When I sent that picture to the late Dick Slattery, Dick said, "Boy, that looks just like when I dug there all those years ago." So that's professional. It's now in a New York museum in New York. And there's Dick Slattery on the left, and with his dates up top. And I've written, if you can learn a lot about Dick Slattery. My citation is there. I wrote a biographical sketch of Dick Slattery in 2007. He was very pleased to have his work commemorated in an official archaeological publication. Here are shell necklaces, lots and lots of shell necklaces. And this actually comes from the Quarterly Bulletin of the Archaeological Society of Virginia by a fellow called Ben McCary, who actually purchased a lot of relic materials from Southwest Virginia. This is labeled as coming from the Robey Maiden collection. So this is actually in an archaeological journal. Here are two Smith County Gorgets, which are at the Smithsonian / the National Museum of the American Indian. And these are pictures I took when I was in Suitland visiting there. The one on the left is a so-called Saltville style engraved gorget, and again you can see it's a stylized rattlesnake. And if you look at the top of the gorget, underneath the suspension holes, you can actually see the characteristic chevrons of the rattlesnake's tail. And then on the right, labeled at the National Museum of the American Indian, is a Citico style engraved gorget from Broadford. Broadford is up the North Holston River, just 3 or 4 miles from Saltville. Here are two more from Broadford, two more gorgets from Broadford, also in the Archaeological Society of Virginia's Quarterly Bulletin. And these pictures were taken by Waldo Wadle, who was actually a plains archaeologist, but who was inveigled into going to Saltville by Dick Slattery. Dick Slattery got into archaeology as a kid at the Smithsonian Institution when Wadle was there, and Slattery, who'd been on that trip as a kid, told Wadle about Saltville, and Wadle went to Saltville. And years ago, when I was working with the former editor of the Archaeological Society of Virginia Bulletin, he said, I never understood how it was that the dean of the Plains Archaeology got to Saltville, and that was the explanation. He got to Saltville because of Slattery. But again, these are gorgets from Broadford. Now, I wish my life would be easy when I go to relic collections or amateur museums. This is a front and back picture of a gorget that comes from the Rankin Museum in Ellerby. Rankin's now dead. He was a doctor, but also a relic collector, and the collection's been sold, so I don't know where this is now. But when I photographed it in 2007, it's a classic Saltville-style gorget with the coiled-up rattlesnake around the center hole and 2 suspension holes. And on the back you can see Smith County, Virginia, Chilhowie School, Kelly Berry. And Kelly Berry was the mayor in 1954. Kelly Berry was the mayor of Chilhowie and a relic collector. And I wish all of the relic collections that I study, the amateur collections, were so well labeled as this one. So this comes from Chilhowie. It's about 10 miles to the east. Here's a typical relic show. I showed you Ron Harris, the collector, in the early part of this presentation. This is Fletcher, North Carolina in 2006. And these shows have a really nice congenial family atmosphere. Just like any other kind of collectors. The rare collectors and the amateurs are a friendly, sociable group. Here are a couple of examples of what I call the relic collectors' literature. So the folks who collect these relics publish journals and articles which are, as far as I can tell, almost never, maybe never, quoted by the professional archaeologists. So there are like two parallel worlds of professional archaeology and amateur archaeology, or relic collectors' archaeology. The one on the left shows the Central States Archaeological Journal, a journal which I published in, and that's again a typical relic collection with glass cases and objects stored and saved. And on the right is a relatively recent issue of the Prehistoric American. It's also a journal I've published in. So to understand the nature of Mississippi and Southwest Virginia, one has to comb through these journals to see them. Going back to the Fletcher show, these objects are for sale. This is not a particularly good example of a gorget, but it is labeled as coming from Chilhowie, and it's offered for the price of $2,900. And if you look closely, you can see it sort of looks like a turtle. But I include this slide to indicate the kind of value that these objects have on the market. High quality gorgets bring and command very substantial prices. This is a picture of Bill Thompson's Chilhowie Gorget. Bill Thompson was for many years the treasurer of the Archaeological Society of Virginia, and he had a wife. He married a lady from Chilhowie, and so this was a Gorget in the late Bill Thompson's private collection, and he allowed me. He brought this to the Archaeological Society of Virginia meeting that year, and he allowed me to take a photograph of it on the front seat of his car. This is a Gorget that was formerly on a display at the Smithfield plantation in Blacksburg. I live in Blacksburg, so I'm very familiar and written a lot about the Smithfield plantation, which was an early settlement site for early European settlement site. And this is simply labeled a Gorget from Saltville, Virginia, and has no other information on it. And the legend on the card is wrong. These Gorgets were not worn for protection. They were, as I said earlier, primarily religious and symbolic and ceremonial objects, which said something about the rank or status of the wearer. This is John Muller. John Muller is a famous archaeological, anthropological author. He wrote a Harvard PhD thesis about Gorget styles, and in fact in 1964 visited Saltville, met with many of the people, Robey Maiden and others that I've been talking about, and then took pictures of many of their Gorgets, which were later published in a book by Brain and Phillips. But here he is. He came down to visit in 2005, and it's the high school in Chilhowie is behind him, and he's standing on the field from which probably at least 100, maybe as many as 300 Indian graves were simply dug up in a frenzy in 1954 when this high school was built. Here are a couple of small Saltville Gorgets photographed in downtown Saltville at the home of the late Chub Arnold. And you can see that these are nice, pretty shell objects, and these came locally from Saltville. In fact, they may have come from Chub's backyard. Here's my review of Gorgets, my review article, which was published in 2010, with a picture of a Saltville-style Gorget on the cover, and you can read in the article. You can read about that there. It's online at the link I put at the bottom of the slide. This is Chilhowie, and these are two Chilhowie pipes. This comes from a source which, as far as I know, has never been referenced by the professional archaeologist. It's a fellow called Gordon Hart, the late Gordon Hart, who published a book called his Prehistoric Pipe Rap. He was a relic collector who was interested in pipes. He published a book, if I recall, in 1978, and then published a second book in 1999. And he visited Chilhowie. On the left in the photograph is Doug Heffinger, late Doug Heffinger, who I knew. And when the Interstate 81 was being put through Chilhowie, Doug realized that the Interstate 81 was going to go over a very important Indian sites. And as described in this book, Doug went out and collected objects from that site. And if he hadn't done it, then they would have been lost entirely. There was no professional archaeology, no professional interest in the archaeology at that point. And so Doug went out and collected a lot of relics, including these two classic stone pipes from Holstonia. A few miles downriver, there was a site called the Cornelius site, which was dug by the Wolf Hills chapter of the Archaeological Society of Virginia for a number of years, and we're still awaiting a final report on that. And these are pipes which came from that site in Washington County. And again, Gordon Hart collected those. They've been passed now through many private collections, but these we can reasonably well document as coming from Holstonia. Tommy Butel is a very wealthy Indian relic collector who I visited, and this particular stone platform pipe is said to have been dug by Robey Maiden in quote a vegetable garden in Saltville. This is a picture I took when I visited Tommy Butel in his home. These come up for auction sometimes. Here's a pipe labeled as coming from Rich Valley in Smith County, that's to the north of Saltville, and was offered for $4,000 in 2007 at the Old Barn auction, which comes out of Findlay, Ohio. And it's said that this comes with, quote, a Davis certificate of authenticity. There are individuals who simply take on the role of being, quote, authorities on authenticity, and they sign certificates. These are well known in the relic collectors community, though one wonders what their real value is in terms of the overall story. This is the collection of Saltville pipes in the Smithsonian collection. This is when I visited Suitland in 2007, and I want to call your attention especially to the very, very large platform pipe which is at the left of the picture. This was found by Robey Maiden in a cave behind the Madame Russell Church in Saltville, and it was sold to George Gustav High. George Gustav High was a fabulous and well-known relic collector in the 1930s who drove all over the country buying everything in sight. There's an article about him called Everything But the Kitchen Sink. And the pipe that Maiden found was sold to High, and then eventually the High collection became the National Museum of the American Indian, went to the National Museum of the American Indian, and High made a plaster cast reproduction, I'll show you the next picture, and sent that back to Robey Maiden. And so there's the pipe, which is now in the Space Farms collection. And when I picked that up, I assumed, I didn't know this story when I picked the pipe up, and I assumed it was going to be a stone pipe. And I picked it up, my hand went way up in the air because it was just the plaster cast reproduction that High had sent back to Robey Maiden. And the correspondence in the literature, I've put in the article, the correspondence which describes that. Here's another pipe. George West wrote an article, wrote a column about pipes, or wrote a book about pipes, probably newly found in 1934. We have some background for this, but not much. Here's one which is in the Virginia Historical Society in Richmond. It's a platform pipe, quote, one of the finest examples found in Virginia, covered with incised chevrons with the square box eyes, but there's no provenience information, so we don't know where this comes from, but presumably from Smith and Washington counties. Here's a pipe from the Keywood Site. This again was published in the Quarterly Bulletin of the Archaeological Society of Virginia. The Keywood Site is just about a mile south of Saltville in Washington County. And this was in the Robey Maiden collection when it was seen in photographs by Waldo Wadle, who I've talked about, in 1940. Now, another source of information comes from Who's Who in Indian Relics. Who's Who in Indian Relics is a series of 11 volumes published irregularly over a period of 57 years. And typically there are 50 to 100 entries which show pictures of collectors and their collections. And the collectors paid to be included in this. So this is a very long-term series, and it's fascinating to look at, and I'm not going to show you some of the pictures. It covers the entire Mississippian region, if you remember Ann Otterson's map, which covers a lot of the country. But if you go through these 11 volumes and you look, you can find lots of examples of Indian relics which came from Holstonia, from Smith and Washington counties. So here's the John Orr Collection. I have no idea where this collection is now, but John Orr was based in Bristol, and he drove a milk collecting truck, which meant that he would visit lots and lots of dairy farmers in Holstonia. And obviously he would say, "What have you found lately?" And from it he collected many objects. So on the left you can see this incredible Gorget collection. The big ones are called mask Gorgets, all presumably from his route. And on the right are his platform pipes. Just amazing collection of artifacts from Holstonia, and I have no idea what happened to that collection. This one I know about. This is the Fred Sharp collection. Fred Sharp is a very, very interesting fellow who ran a bar and a restaurant in Marion. And I wish I'd known him. He was seemed like a really, really strong character. And on the left, the two pictures, one of him and one of the collection, were taken from Who's Who in Indian Relics in Volume 3 in 1972. And that collection I finally was able to track down. It's now owned by his daughter, Stephanie Sharp Thomas, who lives in Tidewater, and I was able to visit her and actually take pictures of the Fred Sharp collection. And again, the point of this is that Fred Sharp was a notable collection, but not especially notable. And you can see the incredible collection of gorgets and other shell objects that he was able to accumulate in Marion. This is the Charlie Burnett collection. This is taken from Who's Who in Indian Relics, Volume 3 in 1972. Burnett is a retired firefighter, and this collection comes almost entirely from Smith and Washington counties, and most of it came from Clarence Maiden. Burnett was a big purchaser from Clarence Maiden, and you notice the number of platform pipes and the number of gorgets which are shown in this picture. Here's Charlie Burnett's collection, pictures taken by me back in 2005 and 2008, and Charlie has more than 50 gorgets in his collection, and you can see, not in detail, but you can see in general some of the platform pipes on the left, and you can see some of the gorgets in the pictures on the right. This is again, rarely do I get this well defined an object, but this is from the Charlie Burnett collection, and on the right you can see a platform pipe which is labeled as coming from the Grinstead Cave, which is near Chilhowie, and on the left there's a copper bead which came from the high school site in Chilhowie. That's Clarence Maiden in his old age. I don't know what the date of this picture is. This is a picture courtesy of Charlie Burnett. Charlie Burnett is on the right, and I would guess it's around 1985. This is the Tommy Butel collection. I mentioned Tommy Butel earlier of Tuckasegee, North Carolina, wealthy Indian relic collector who's currently selling off his collection. These are, quote, Virginia shell objects, mostly from along the Holston River. And as I said, these gorgets typically they sell for thousands of dollars. These are gorgets from the C.C. Hatfield collection. Hatfield is an interesting guy. He was a many-year Saltville physician who sometimes accepted Indian relics in payment for his services. I photographed these in Aberdeen when they were exhibited by his son, and several, maybe more than several of these gorgets are fakes. So this is, I warned you I was going to show you one or two slides where the objects were probably fakes or reproduction, and several of these are probably fake or reproduction objects. This is William Rudy, who actually lived in Grayson County, but he had also a good collection, and you can see on the upper center, you can see the gorgets, and on the right is my picture. I visited him in 2007. He's now dead, and the collection is now curated by his daughter, who I've been in contact with. This is a collection I always wanted to see, but I never got to see. This comes from Who's Who in Indian Relics, Volume 9. This is a Carson Manual collection labeled Southwest Virginia Mississippian Objects. And you see the classic objects, shell beads, shell gorgets from the region. I think it was his uncle, was Tater Manual, who was one of the folks who dug relics. These are pipes in Smith County in the Tony Adams collection. Tony Adams I know well, and this collection is intact. This is Pat Bass. This is a newspaper clipping of Pat Bass and her collection. It's about 1970. I don't have good provenience, but you can see the date on the article there. And when she died, she left many of her items to the Museum of the Middle Appalachians in Saltville. And so here you see my pictures of the Museum of the Middle Appalachians in Saltville. And this is only one of two places you can go to see gorgets from Smith and Washington County. The first place is you can go to New Jersey and see them in the Space Farms Zoo and Museum collection, and here you can see them in the Museum of the Middle Appalachians in Saltville, Virginia. And again, you see on the right the typical gorgets. In the upper right, with the right-hand picture, you can see a conch shell from which the American Indians would have cut their gorgets. This finally is Ethel Brown of Wytheville. She was a nurse and a cotton farmer. And again, all I know about this is that simply we've got these newspaper pictures of the collection she accumulated. Wytheville, if I was going to pick a third county, which was Mississippian, Wytheville will probably be the third county. Now, engraved marine shell gorget counts one way I measure the Mississippian nature of Smith and Washington counties. By 2010, I could document about 150 marine shell gorgets, and today my account approaches 300, actually maybe closer to 400 today. So, in conclusion, there's an incredible array of Mississippian gorgets and platform pipes from Smith and Washington counties that are unmatched, absolutely unmatched by any other location in Virginia. And sadly, any chance of getting proper archaeology of Holstonia is long gone. But for the sake of Yuchi and for the sake of Virginia history, surely we must try and reconstruct this story to the extent we can. That's the end. Thank you.